And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hello, Josh. Hey, everyone.
It's
Glad
the Dark
to see everyone
Ozarks.
on Tuesday.
It is the Dark Ozarks, and it's Wednesday night once again, February 9th, 2022.
And we're talking Noir Travel.
Yes, we are. A lot of travel, actually. and not just through distance, also through time as well as space.
Exactly. And that, anyone that's thinking that this is going to be, you want to stay here and here and here for your next vacation, that's not exactly what we're talking about.
Something that has, I personally find this really interesting. I want to get your thoughts on this. So many things about the Ozarks are essentially in conflict with itself. Mm-hmm. And I would say that travel, settlement, migration patterns in the Ozarks is no exception, because in one sense, the Ozarks have been an ancestral crossroads, a traveling through that has gone on since well before recorded history.
Yes.
At the same time that this region is undergoing that process of transit and crossroads, it is also a place where ancestrally folks put down some really deep roots and really stake their claim on land and a way of life that goes well beyond an individual's lifespan.
Yes. And quite a long time ago, they had already been staying put for generations and generations.
Yes.
Which is, when you think about it, pretty remarkable, because settlers and even European explorers really didn't come through here much until the late 1700s. So we're really just talking about roughly 220, 30 years.
And that's very true. And something that is really, I think, a connotation with Ozarks, back hills, backwoods country, is that sense of ancestral time, the sense that these are family lands, that the ties to the land go back a long time ago, and connect with something very, very deep, very elemental. And I would posit that is true in many cases. Interestingly enough, in terms of a larger chronology, a larger timeline, it really hasn't been that long.
Exactly. Yeah. So there is a duality there. And I think, first of all, I think we have to note that first Europeans through here were really following a lot of the trails and trade routes that had been established by Indian tribes for hundreds of years.
Yes.
But when the French came through, they were exploring. They were looking for furs. It's things like that. Mining. They started mining in eastern Missouri. The Spanish were coming through. Of course, the land, basically all this land is kind of going back and forth between them and claims for the British. And so with the Spanish, we get lots of tales of, lost gold, etc., and conquistadors coming through, and which did happen.
It did. The conquistadors coming through for sure. It is, to me, it is, and we've covered this in depth. It's not the topic for tonight, but that idea of lost gold or lost silver, the Spanish mines, the Spanish caves, particularly in the Upper White and the Upper White River.
Right. Well,
In
I mean,
my
there's also tales of, lost forts for both the French and the Spanish. I mean,
yes,
we're both,
and that certainly, I mean, that's very realistic.
it is. Well, I mean, well, we're both, we're familiar with particular stories on that have been brought to us in the past.
Mhm.
So,
And it and that, again, talking about these um these sort of existent states of contradiction, I think that's um so much of what we're dealing with. The central Missouri Ozarks, which is of course the southern part of the state, in many ways, very, in early years of settlement, and prior, even prior, because when it was Osage hunting
mhm,
land, the Osage utilized the space largely seasonally, and they were a migratory people. The Osage were were a Sioux or a Lakota dialect people,
mhm,
and they were seasonally in transit
right.
with winter camps and summer camps, largely based on following the game
Mhm.
during the season, as well as other things. And so in one sense, this was a region that at various times had nobody in it.
Or very, very few people.
Mhm. And at other times, it could be unbelievably dangerous
Mhm.
based on the people who were in it.
Exactly. And I think that's one thing people don't necessarily think of either, is that some of these tribes did not get along with each other, and they fought
Mhm.
um had feuds and rivalries. And so there was danger in those days. It wasn't just more recent. But I think an interesting note is some of these really early explorations, travelers through, um, all of the legends for the treasures and all of those kind of things kind of give rise to some of the danger later on in some of the dark tales.
It does. It does. And I think it's fair to say that regardless of the people group, whether you're talking about um, the Germans, as we talked extensively about last week, which was so much
Mhm.
fun.
It
Uh,
was.
the Irish, the Scotch Irish, the
Mhm,
English, the French, the Spanish, the Osage, the Quapaw, the
mhm,
Caddo, or, and I think it's fair to say that we can conjecture quite realistically, the Bluff Dweller people who preceded them,
mhm,
who were people groups for which we do not have names.
right.
That all of these peoples faced faced danger, and they faced the unknown.
Mhm,
It's fair to say they all, in various forms and with various levels of perceptions, faced the metaphysical,
mhm.
and they told tales
Yeah,
about it.
agreed. I mean, a good example are some of the tribes that came in later that settled around the mounds. We've talked about this before, is that they told tales based on what they observed and what they surmised about the people who'd been there before, including that the mounds had supernatural paranormal activity around them.
Yes. And now, one of the things, and I want to dig into this a little bit. This was common throughout the Ozarks, but it was particularly common in the central Missouri Ozarks. Again, that Shannon, Oregon County region with Current
Mhm,
River, Jacks Fork, 11 Point. Um, Enormous number of springs,
mhm,
incredibly beautiful springs.
mhm,
Later, many of those springs would become home to grist mills and various, essentially, neighborhoods. Turner Spring, Klepsik Mill, Alley Spring,
mhm.
uh, those particularly come to mind. back in 2009, I had the opportunity to make a concerted effort to visit a number of those, and in a sort of a circle through that part of the Ozarks. And something that was, first of all, really noticeable was the energy of the space. These deep springs are, of course, from a natural phenomena perspective, are impressive.
Yes.
And for a dirt flatlander like me, when when a spring is a wet seepy spot in the mud,
Yeah.
to walk into, say, for example, Blue Spring, in that region, there's several Blue Springs in the Missouri and Arkansas Ozarks, but the Blue Springs that I'm talking about is near Eminence, and comparatively speaking, south of Rolla, quite a ways. And it's incredibly, to call it rural isn't even, I mean, it's,
yeah, that's overstating. Yeah.
It really, really is. And for people who may not be familiar with our parts of the country, the idea that there's just areas that are thousands and thousands of acres of timber and ridge and creek, and there's nobody in them even now.
Yeah.
And to come into that space with this gigantic, just marine blue spring. I mean, it's like the closest I can say is that it feels as though you've stepped into Middle Earth and you're on some sort of Lord of the Rings adventure that Tolkien wrote about. And we know that just like the mounds, the Native American tribes regarded the springs as sacred or holy sites.
Yes, and with special powers.
Yes, and I would strongly concur with that. There is an energy there. Of course, there's a lot of water energy, but there's just an energy there that is inexpressible, and it's dangerous. I mean, these are deep. They have strange currents. This is not a place you do not want to play in this water under normal circumstances. It's very it's unbelievably beautiful, but to me it's also very intimidating.
It can be. I mean, and over my direction, there's corollaries because we have so many underground rivers and caverns, and some springs, but typically those places with so much energy and being intimidating and so forth are places that are underground. That we have rivers that are flowing underground that are much larger than some of these rivers we're talking about.
Yes.
And when you are in those proximities, those are areas that do have a lot of energy, even if looking around on top of the ground, you can't see why. You sense it.
You do. And that this network, essentially an energy network, is honeycombed beneath so much of the Ozarks, has an effect on the top side. It certainly reminds me, Greer's Spring, I think, opens up into the 11 Point, I believe, in Oregon County. And if memory serves, you give people an idea, the 11 Point is a pretty decent sized river. Upstream from Greer's, from the spring, But at the point of the confluence of the spring with the 11 Point River, it doubles the size of the river.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't give respect and reverence to those spaces, you are being foolish, because
Yes,
they exhibit a lot more influence than we give them credit for sometimes.
they really do. Something in our notes sort of about transit and community and settlement that
Mhm.
really jumped out to me was, I'll just throw these words out.
I never know what's coming when you do this.
Native born Americans of Scotch Irish ancestry, upland Southerners who were stockmen, farmers, and hunters.
Well, you just described my family.
And a good chunk of mine. a, a very good chunk of mine. And the more that I began digging into this process, the more, that the so many of the folks that, the folks within that category came into the Ozark Hills with a concerted desire for maintaining their way of life.
Yes. And the land lent itself to that too.
Yes.
And so in some ways things didn't change a whole lot for a very long time for these people.
And I think in part because of a concerted effort to keep it that way.
That's true. It's funny, for various reasons, at different times, the whole region, and Missouri in particular, is known as the Show Me State. Known to be, frankly, cliquish, and wary of outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
I've known people who have moved away and then moved back in 10, 15 years and said that they're treated like they never lived here.
Yes.
And to be perfectly honest, I think part of that is sort of a generational trace memory of things that happened. There's been plenty of times that you had to be wary of strangers.
Yes, and the Civil War and the years following, well, the years preceding the Civil War, particularly, pardon me, particularly along the Kansas border, and then the years after the Civil War, really throughout all of Missouri.
Right. And also, a good example found actually in Arkansas too, and source materials from Arkansas Travelers. It's a book by Andrew Milson. And he talks about, he said, the geography of exploration. And he's talking particularly about two guys who are coming through the Arkansas Ozarks in the 1820s, and they stop at a cabin, and their names are Finston and George, and they stop at the Meriwether cabin. And while they're there, two men appear at the door, and are described as one is tall, pale, thin young man in a dirty blanket coat, and story of his misfortunes. And the Meriwethers gave them some sweet potatoes, and the Finston, one of these travelers, gave him $50. And then the Meriwethers talked and judged that the stranger's story was very unsatisfactory, and referred to them as vagabonds, and warned Finston and George that they probably had, they were probably being followed by these guys and had evil intentions, and that they needed to be vigilant for all the villains along the way. And they were also regaled with versions of Rawhead and Bloody Bones. And so Finston writes in his diary that they did become quite uneasy as they were traveling through Arkansas at that point, between the vagabonds and Rawhead and Bloody Bones.
Oh my gosh. And did they say which version of Rawhead they were getting?
No, it does not. It just says that Mr. Merriweather had told them. It just said that he was uneasy about the Rawhead and Bloody Bones stories that Mr. Merriweather had told them. So Rawhead and Bloody Bones was around pretty early in the game.
That is, I love, and do we know what year that was or thereabouts?
Well, this part, it just says the 1820s. I didn't dig into the bibliography, but
that is, I love that because that, you know, is reasonably placing the Rawhead and Bloody Bones story really with the first beginnings of folks of white settlers into the Ozarks in mass. I love that. And now there's another side that I couldn't help but think about in this process, which is you get some folks who are a little green coming in, and you sometimes you just can't pass up an opportunity to unsettle them.
Well, that's true. That, you know, you got to mess with Flatlanders, you know.
Yeah. And I'm a former Green Flatlander, so you know, one of those things. I sort of just in coming off of that or continuing that, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, who is pretty well known in particularly the Central Missouri academic circles for his travels and journaling and looking for lead mines and finding the Osage. And also launching his exploits from, I believe, Potosi, and not thinking a lot of course, Schoolcraft was comparatively young at the time, and I believe from New York State.
I think so,
yeah. I think a pretty unseasoned, comparatively speaking, unseasoned and genteel young man getting through the rough and tumble wilds of mining country of the Eastern Ozarks initially. And he wrote that the settlers he met, quote, could only talk of bears, hunting, and the like, and the rude pursuits and the coarse enjoyments of the hunter state, which all they knew. Most of the frontiersmen had, quote, either embraced hunting from the love of ease or singularity, or fled from society to escape the severity of the laws and to indulge in unrestrained passion. Women in the area had few children, and there was a high infant mortality rate. Contemporary writer Edwin Jones noted that the inhabitants have, almost without exception, a sickly appearance.
Not a lot of vitamin C.
And I do think that it speaks to elements of that early settlement and early industry that we're talking about, and the fact that this is unbelievably rough country, and and some pretty difficult ways of life at the same time.
I think so. I think maybe a comparison for people is, we often think of, say, people traversing, the Sahara and places like that, um, and how difficult it is and harsh the conditions are. But at the same time, you have established routes that have been there for thousands of years. So you have settlements that people have figured out how to survive in those conditions.
Yeah.
Whereas here, these were people who were going in first and didn't have those safety nets, so to speak.
No. Very, very true. And I think something that is interesting to think about, that the wilderness of North America, in the scheme of things, could almost be considered sort of the wilderness of North America during time of settlement, almost a hiccup in the larger scheme of of population. A great number of Native American peoples apparently had been decimated by disease, introduced early on,
Right.
a couple of hundred years prior, so that by the time that Anglo and Saxon settlers were beginning to reach the quote unquote interior of North America, there were, comparatively speaking, not that many people.
Right. Much fewer than had been there. And that's something most people don't think about. And so, and at various times there were still epidemics. So you had a lot of things going on. You had the harsh conditions. You had a lot of epidemics that the European settlers were susceptible to as well.
Yes.
And aside from just being, on the edge of things and nothing to fall back on if it goes wrong.
Yes. And you think about the propensity for accident. Again, this is a very unbelievably harsh place. We sometimes think that it's harsh now. It was nothing compared to what it was. Absolutely nothing. I think it would be hard to even wrap our heads around how difficult life was at that time, and the simple fact that individuals, not in some cases not only survived but in essence thrived to go on and produce considerable family lines, successful enterprises, coming in, the idea that coming into the interior, quote unquote, and in a comparatively short period of time, establishing small villages, that you have a general store, you have a grist mill, you have your gardens, you have your livestock. You can sustain, you can survive, and you can build on that. And then the just the industry, the industriousness of the people who are coming in. Okay, so we got ourselves, we hand built ourselves a sawmill. So now we can build a better mill, and then we can cut down
a house or whatever.
Yes. And then in some cases start transiting, floating that lumber downstream and selling it. And I would say that there's there's two sides of this. Of course, so much, especially during the railroad boom in the latter half of the 19th century, lumbering, cutting down of trees really took on epic and not unsustainable levels.
Right.
There's very little virgin forest. There is some, but there is very little remaining in the Ozarks. And a lot of people don't realize that. You see our hills, they're covered with trees. We have dense lengthy forests, which are incredibly beautiful. At the same time, coming in and realizing that this is all new growth, and
Yeah, it's all mostly 100 years or younger, mostly.
yes, yes. At the same time, and so this is, I'm the wholesale logging of the mountains. I think is not something that I sign off on at all. But the other side of this, you look at these settler families coming in to the interior, and this is a time when cutting down of trees, and even later, incredibly dangerous, absolutely backbreaking work.
Yeah.
Level of exertion, the likes of which very few of us will ever know in our lifetime, and being willing to do that, and then after you've after you felled the trees, after you've gone through this entire process, you still have to transit them. You still have to.
Yeah.
It just the
tie
story.
Yeah, the tie hats, they make barges out of the logs, and it was all to make railroad ties.
Yes. Just that level. I think before we, in a wholesale condemnation of the industry, I think we also have to balance that with these individuals that, first of all, could work hard, could, their day's work would kill any of us.
Probably, yes.
and, and second of all, these, in so many cases, these individuals here in the hills, even extending well into the 20th century, the folks is selling lumber to the railroads well into the 30s and 40s. Before we get on our environmental high horse and condemn them, think about the fact that all they wanted to do was make sure that they could feed their families and have a little bit extra money.
Exactly. You have to look at it all in context to that.
You do. And it's, that I think something that is appealing about the Ozarks, for a wide variety of ways, is so much of the Ozarks really is a working man's story.
It really is. A working man's story, and a story of hopefully second chances for so many people.
Yes. and people came to the Ozarks oftentimes for that. And so it's to me, it's so interesting. In so many ways, the Ozarks are a backwater. In other cases, people were coming to the hills specifically because it was a backwater.
Exactly. Opposite sides of the coin. But,
it is
during that time period, and when you would have these sort of vagabond travelers and so forth, that a lot of legends grew up and recurring tales came out. Unfortunately, there seems to be a common thread of travelers meeting their untimely end when they are coming through the Ozarks, staying at a cabin or an inn or something. And that seems to kind of be a universal dark tale. Happened a lot, where the peddler comes through and he's got a few coins in his pocket, and he's offered 2 bits or even $1 to stay, but if you take the whole thing, and who's going to miss him? That happened a lot.
Mm-hmm. It is. The hills can be very dark, leaning more into a metaphysical tale that I really like. I think we briefly talked about this off camera last week. Is a story that was recorded by Richard and Judy Dockery Young in their Ozark Ghost Tales book, which I highly recommend getting, although it's out of print. So if you can find an out of print copy. but I believe the story may have originated or been um, collected around Miller, Missouri, which I find very interesting. And mainly
Well, maybe
because,
not if you know Miller.
well, I guess interesting because I think that area is very evocative to me. At the
Mhm.
same time, there's areas on the Springfield Plain, or quote unquote the Springfield Prairie, that if you don't realize what you're looking at, can look very simply rural Midwestern.
Yeah, true.
It is a a topography that is very different than, they say, Shannon or Oregon County, or the Boston Mountains around, encircling the Buffalo River. Those types of spaces, these spaces that simply appear quintessentially Ozarks to the outsider. Areas sort of often north and west of Springfield, Missouri, can simply look like really great farmland, and it is.
With deep ravines.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot more rock than it looks like when you're
Yeah,
driving through
that's true.
it. and this particular tale is of a traveler who, leaves his cabin, um, and has a couple days walk to go visit family members. And night falls. He's looking for a place to stay, and sees a cabin on a hilltop, with a low light, dim light burning inside. And he knocks, and a rough voice answers, and he goes in. And there are three dark, shrouded men playing cards at a table.
Hmm.
And there is a bed in the corner with a figure wrapped up in the bed. And he inquires gently if he can stay. And with as few words as possible, the men acquiesce, but say, "Don't disturb the woman in the bed." And so he gets into one side of the bed and falls asleep, wakes up. It's the middle of the night. The moonlight is shining through the windows. The fire has gone out. The shrouded men are gone. And perhaps he's a bit lascivious. Perhaps he's just curious. We'll let that, be to the listener's decision. But curiosity gets the best of him, and he wants to see what this woman looks like.
Sure.
And of course, they are sharing a bed, so
Oh, there you go.
and he, which I think is also an important thing, just in terms of historical context, was that people of all ages and both genders shared beds in these times.
Yes. And it wasn't, and it wasn't always sexual.
No. And I would even say, to a great deal, oftentimes it wasn't. Both of my maternal grandparents spent most of their childhood sharing beds with their siblings,
Mhm.
of which there were many.
Yeah.
And I know that my grandpa, when he would be on work crews in the 20s and 30s, it was perfectly normal for them to, bunk two workers to a room, and there was one bed.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so,
those things were very, very common. I mean, my mother talked about, you know, having shared the bed growing up with, siblings, and her little sister always, she'd wake up with her little sister hanging onto her nightgown. Uh, because
and,
she was afraid.
yes. And so this idea of one person to a bed is actually the height of luxury, and we don't even think about it oftentimes at this point.
Yeah.
And so the story, the contextually now in the mid or earlier 19th century in the rural Ozarks, the idea of two travelers sharing a bed because there's no other place to sleep is not really that unusual. And not it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this, but not nearly as creepy as it sounds.
Exactly.
And so this traveler is curious, and he cautiously gets up and pulls the covers back to see and of course he's got this idea that she's probably incredibly beautiful, and he'd just like to take a look at her.
Yeah.
And he sees the face of the woman, and it is a cadaver. It is a weathered skeletal corpse, and he screams and falls out of bed, and at least in his mind the skeletal hands come reaching and flailing over as the corpse rolls over on top of him, and he scrambles for the door and runs outside and pretty much doesn't stop running for the rest of the night.
As most people probably would at that point.
Yes, I think that's very fair. I think that's a very sane response. And then as this sort of gets his wits about him, and he does come to a small town, a hamlet of some sort that has some constable or law enforcement. And he goes and says, this happened. I don't know what you need to, and they say, well, can you take us back? And they go back to the spot, and there's nothing there.
No, yeah, there's no cabin, there's nothing. Yeah.
No.
I do like that story. And it's kind of interesting, that it is from the Miller area. Miller is a unique little place, even linguistically. Now, Miller is like about 800 people. It actually has two distinct dialects. And I know this because I worked with someone for a very long time who was from Miller. And a linguist who years and years, this would have been probably in the 70s, who worked for Missouri State University, happened to come into the bank that she worked in. And in the course of, and this was not in Miller, the course of conversation, he says, "You're from Miller." And she said, "Well, how do you know that?" And the irony is, most people who hear her talk would think that she was from South Georgia. And he goes, specifically, you have a South Miller accent. And she said, "Well, I did grow up on the south side of Miller." And he went on to explain that there are two dialects in Miller. Now, how that happened, I don't know.
Oh, I love that.
But people from Miller have an accent that you would think that they were from the Delta or from Georgia.
We need to, at some point soon, we need to get Dale in on this conversation because he has a lot of family in Miller, or has had around Miller. Yes. Yeah.
He may, they may know who I'm talking about. Not surprising.
And again, I think that speaks to that sense of travel, that sense of transit, folks coming from places and retaining bits and pieces of their former identity, creating new ones at the same time. And lore
Scotch Irish, by the way, too. So
which is a transit story in and of itself. Something that I'm gonna, in part because it's tragic, in part because it's a shipwreck. It's only peripherally related to the topic tonight, but there was a note that I came across that really jumped out at me. 1839, Perry, Missouri, Saxon and Prussian Lutherans settling a German Lutheran settlement
Okay.
Martin Stephan was their leader. They were seeking freedom of religion was
Mhm.
their primary reason, because they were actually in many cases quite well off,
Yeah,
and
a lot of
they're
the
in
Germans were.
and at the same time, um, of the group, 600 made it, and this was, probably 1838 thereabouts, because so comparatively modern, comparatively industrialized. Of the three ships that these essentially religious refugees sailed upon, one of the ships was lost.
Mhm.
And to me, there's something very haunting about that. And we don't think about the sea. Missouri is landlocked,
Yeah.
and yet there's a Missouri community that was founded that 1/3 of the people who were meant to be there,
Mhm.
that were, I would strongly speculate that were these settlers, friends, confidants, family,
Mhm.
um, were lost in the Atlantic.
Mhm.
3 ships leave, 2 arrive, and those memories, those stories, those experiences, those tears, that's all part of our Ozarks and our state history now.
Mhm. And something that we shouldn't forget, and that's something that too often those things get left behind, and I've been really excited about the activity on the page this week, and there's been a lot of comments about, oh, I didn't know that happened, in my own hometown, things like that. And so, that's what it's part of this is all about.
It is. And I think, jumping on just sort of continuing that subject, we talk about paranormal a lot,
Hmm.
and in at times paranormal, less so now. It's much less stigmatized now, but certainly there's times that you get raised eyebrows and people
Sure.
going, oh, what, I don't know. I may have religious objections to that idea, or I may just be terribly skeptical, or that's not what normal people talk about. And I'm like, well, I'm not normal, so I talk about it. I don't care.
It's
But
never bothered me whether I was normal or not.
hashtag not my problem. But in that process, something that I think that folklore and the paranormal do, that's incredibly valuable, and I advocate this considerably, is that whether you've had a paranormal experience or not, or whether you believe in that in that or not, something that is objectively valuable is that individuals' stories, their history, our history, is intertwined with ghost stories and folklore,
Hmm.
and it is intertwined in a way that you cannot get from a dry textbook talking about dates and times.
I agree. I agree. And it gives a context in a way that just dry academic textbooks can't.
And of course, those have their places. We use them a lot, and they're invaluable, but they do not give the human experience. And I find it so wonderfully contradictory that you really have to seek out the dead to find the stories of the living.
I like that turn of phrase.
I'll write it down. I
Because I'll
think it was.
forget. But yes, yeah, remember that one.
In that, jumping to one of the great transit spaces of the Ozarks, which is truly world renowned, is Route 66.
Yes.
And we have a we have I wrote that down. We have a this sometimes very brash, overtly American, kitschy imagery of Route 66, which that's a wonderful part of it. At the same time, there are a lot of dark tales associated with Route 66, and I happen to know an author who wrote a book about this. And,
gee, gee, I better recall my own material, right?
So first of all, I mean, huge, again, big shout out to you in terms of being an author. You've authored multiple books on these subjects. I've read all of them. They're all awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Let's talk about some of your favorite stories. You did a lot of research for this. Let's talk about, well, first of all, the title of the book and where folks can find it, but then some of your favorite stories that you were able to research.
Missouri's Wicked Route 66, Gangsters and Outlaws on the Mother Road. And basically, you know, the way I approached it was starting at the river, at the Mississippi, and heading west down Route 66. And I think that because we have such the Americana kitsch idea about what Route 66 is, one thing that people don't realize is that it has, well, one, it's been there for hundreds of years because it basically was just built over prior trails that go back hundreds of years. And basically they put the road down where people had figured out was the easiest place to get through anyway. But another thing is it has always been a conduit of contraband and crime. And people don't want to think about that, you know, when they're talking about, oh, this is America. But, you know, and driving a vintage car, you know, across country. But it has always been a matter of stolen money, gold, then it became moonshine, then it became drugs. And now, of course, the majority of Route 66 in Missouri is I-44. And it is known as the Mule Road in law enforcement and court circles. It's the Mule Road, mule being the carrier for drugs. And in fact, to the point that Missouri courts take that as judicial fact. And that is one, and to be perfectly honest, that's why out-of-state cars, particularly with Illinois and Texas plates, get stopped more often. Not saying anyone gets profiled, but just saying. There tends to be a correlation. So, and plus people running from doing these things or murder or whatever, they try to get away. And people have found their demise on Route 66.
Yes. I would say, you know, comparatively speaking, in numbers that would probably shock some people.
Yes, I think so. I don't know what the real figures are, but it's not unusual, to find stories of, body found in the ditch kind of stories. And
Mhm.
that's happened, forever.
Yes.
Um, but I think I think one of the stories that always hit me the hardest in a way, or it ended up meaning something that I included. It was the triple murder at Devil's Elbow
Yes.
near Fort Leonard Wood. It happened back in 1968. Three relatively young men. I think the oldest was 30, and the other two were in their 20s. Worked in a restaurant just off base. Were closing up. They get robbed, taken prisoner, and driven out, shot and left in a ditch, literally.
Yes.
Ultimately, it's one of those cases that, you get a lot of those cases where it's unsolved. We don't know who did it. In this situation, they know who did it. And through a series of events, which read the book and you'll find out, is not held accountable. And as far as the last anyone knew, was still alive and on the run.
Mm.
And I have to admit, after the book was published, I actually had family members of the victims contact me and thank me for covering it, because it's still an open case.
Wow. And whenabouts did this take place?
1968.
Wow.
So we're talking 54 years. The suspect was in his 20s. He could still be out there.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is a propensity of place names in the Ozarks.
Yes.
With the adjective devil.
Yes.
What do you make of that?
Well, in that particular case, Devil's Elbow, it was named for a particularly sharp turn in the river. And in the time that you had keel boats going up the river, they tended to get hung up on rocks and wreck. And so it was the Devil's Elbow because it was so hard to get through. Is where that particular one came from.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
There's Devil's Elbow, Devil's Backbone, Devil's Ridge,
Mm-hmm.
Devil's Well. Been to Devil's Well. Devil's Den. Marble Cave was originally, one of its appellations was Devil's Den.
Mm-hmm. I think there's 4 or 5 different Devil's Dens, I believe.
Yeah. and just the Devil's Promenade.
Yes.
The according to the folks moving in and giving things names, on these roads, and in some cases backcountry spots and bridges, and the devil got around.
He did. And I in some ways I kind of liken it to the Vikings when they named Iceland and Greenland. And the reason they're named that, and because you look at it and it's, wait a minute, Greenland's not green, and Iceland has some very fertile land. Well, they did that on purpose to dissuade other people. Go to Greenland, don't come to Iceland.
Right.
Sometimes I wonder if a little bit of that went on, we'll put devil on the name, maybe other people will stay.
I think that can be very fair. I think it's something that to me I find really interesting, and it works to this day. that as an adjective in the English language, the words devil and the words witch instantly denote something that is forbidden, tempting to know more.
Mm-hmm.
And we understand that it is a space that at least is perceived as strangely set aside for something that we probably shouldn't mess with, but we'd really like to.
Exactly. Literally forbidden fruit.
Yes. And I've often speculated, and I'm curious as your thoughts on this, that in the industrialized North,
Mm-hmm.
the concepts, and in some cases I think it's easier to deal with, but the concepts of essentially the perceptions of the sacred and the profane and
Mm-hmm.
the war between the two is easy to overlook in many cases, or just sort of like, yeah, that's whatever, I don't know, unless you're Lovecraft, and then Katie barred the door. But won't talk about Lovecraft. But you get into particularly the upland South, and the perceptions of the sacred and the profane are oftentimes almost side by side, almost staring at one another.
It's a much more romantic version.
Yes.
In the literary sense.
In the literary sense, yes. And higher stakes, higher conflict, I think even wouldn't necessarily be talked about like this, but a romanticization of the sacred and the profane, and the conflict thereof, and the sense that certainly within the Ozarks, we're in the Bible Belt, we have churches, you can't go anywhere without falling over a church, and yet we have this propensity of place names that are referencing the devil, and certainly plenty of people who are very interested in walking on the dark side, even if they don't necessarily have any clue what it is that they're doing.
Very true. Of course, caveat there. You get a lot. There are a lot of people who want to walk on that dark side everywhere.
Everywhere, yes.
I think even more so, even in the North. I think traditionally, yes, that was sort of you had that that disconnect of the religious with the practical. That is a literary concept. It is not literal. And with the romanticism of the South, it was, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
Yes. And sometimes very literal. And I think that's interesting because those perspectives certainly in the latter half of the 20th century really became derided as backwards and old-fashioned, and you need to modernize, you need to get with the times. These are all figurative things. At the same time, the first person who has an actual paranormal experience, if they have more of what is perceived, now I'm getting into very interesting territory, have more than what is perceived as a backwards primitive perspective or view, might have a paranormal experience and be like, yeah. And someone that has a quote unquote extremely modern or excessively secular view, their first paranormal experience can be an existential crisis for them.
That's true. On the flip side, the other one can also have that existential crisis, because if it's happening to them, it has to be evil. So
absolutely, and we see that a lot.
We do. I mean, in both camps, see it. So
yeah, and interesting enough, our pop culture of everything that goes bump in the night a demon that's coming to claim your soul, hasn't really helped.
No, and again, we've talked about this before, but we know where the blame lies there. We're looking at you, Peter Blatty, because that really did not exist even in the more romanticized versions until The Exorcist.
Right. Right. And I think
It
there
is
was
it's also a commentation on a really good story, the effect a really good story can have.
very much so. And also honoring your source material effectively.
That's true. And and again, there's still a tie in there because the story is centered in St. Louis based on
Yeah,
true events. So
I know. And I still find it fascinating. Many people don't realize that has a direct Missouri and nearly Ozarks tie. And then, of course, in reference to Union, Missouri, Stephen LaChance's experiences with the Union Screaming House, which is in the Ozarks,
yes,
is both fascinating and terrifying.
yes. So it all comes full circle through the Ozarks.
Through all the way through, I know, and that to me speaks of these larger, I was going to say themes, but larger realities of travel, and it's been going on for centuries.
It has, and it in Route 66 is an example that it still goes on, but as time went on, travel again still became was a very wary subject and dangerous, and all kinds of things could happen. When you get to the Civil War, you had people really were afraid of anyone that rode up, because any traveler could be an enemy, could be there to rob you, kill you, burn your house down. And then when you throw bushwhackers in the lot, traveling yourself or dealing with travelers was innately dangerous.
Yes.
And then a lot of stories came out of that too, including ghost stories.
Very much so, yes.
A lot of our phantom soldier stories and so on and so forth.
It is. And the and I think it's reasonable to say, I mean, there's a couple of different things just in terms of hauntings in the Ozarks. The Civil War produced so many, just right here in Missouri and Arkansas, produced so many deaths, violent deaths.
Yeah.
In obviously our documented large scale battles that make it into the history books, but then in the guerrilla fighting, on a personal scale that is very difficult for us to wrap our heads around, and we do not have documentation on most of it.
That's very true. I mean, that is very, very true. I mean, the soldier down at Newtonia is a good example. I mean, he literally was killed because he was recognized of having murdered people. And one of those incidents was over at Exeter, where he decapitated 4 people.
And Exeter is an interesting place all by itself.
Yes, it is. Story for another day.
Yes, it is. But just in sort of this continuation of theme in regards to the paranormal, I've heard a number of stories. I know you have too. And we've experienced some locations that have a great deal of paranormal activity on them, and individuals seeing soldiers, seeing individuals in violent deaths, seeing decapitated specters, phantoms, these types of things that in some cases their appearance looks completely out of place.
it does. But one thing I always tell people, because often people who have those experiences say, well, but that doesn't make sense because nothing happened here. Kind of like the joke plaque that says in 1897 on this spot, nothing happened. But so a lot of people believe that, and it's like, but you can't say that when it came to that time period in the Ozarks, because so much of it was small scale skirmishes and bushwhackers that, and, 2 or 3, even if it was regular soldiers, group of 2 or 3 riding through that, and most of it was not written down exactly. We might know, oh, something happened near this town. Well, that can throw a wide net. And so when people say, I saw this, but nothing happened, well, you don't know that.
No, we do not. And stories of soldiers or men or women in period garb in various levels of potential distress, wandering past the swimming pool or through the hotel lobby.
Exactly. Or through someone's front yard, or whatever.
And the having to, and I think it forces us contextually to have to rethink and realize the way all of this looks now was not what this was 150 years ago.
Not at all. And and then I think if you want to, if we kind of pursue that noir travel aspect to its logical end in the Ozarks, we kind of have to talk about Billy Cook.
Yes, we do. and I think for us at Dark Ozarks, it all begins with Billy Cook and the Peace Cemetery.
Literally, it did.
Yes. America's first the first spree killer, certainly first recognized in popular culture, first probably to a degree commemorated through a film that was produced not long after the event.
Right. Well, it was filmed just within about 6 months of his execution.
Yes. And Billy's story, you can't tell a story without, of course, detailing the horrific nature of his crime.
Yes.
And I'll let you take point on that.
Well, I think Billy Cook is one of those ultimate cautionary tales, especially for the but for the grace of God go I. That it can happen to anyone is the lesson here. That psychopaths, sociopaths are often not born; they are often created by society. And 1928. Youngest of 7 children born during the course of the murder trials. He was actually the first spree or serial killer that was actually studied at length by psychiatrists too. They concluded that he probably watched his father murder his mother when he was 4. Father abandoned he and the 2 sisters that were still at home shortly afterwards in an abandoned mine shaft. The siblings were separated in foster care, and then basically every horror story that you can imagine with foster care happened.
Yes.
Which actually, that case actually led to a lot of reforms. But things were bad enough that he was begging to go to reform school at 12. At 17, he's in the state penitentiary at Jefferson City. Gets out. Various things happen. Things not just one of those, if it can go wrong, it does. At 21, he ends up hitchhiking. Here we go, traveling, hitchhiking to California, working at a small diner in the desert for about 8 or 9 months. Everything seems fine, actually better than they've ever been in his life. And something snapped. And no one really knows.
Yeah.
He started hitchhiking back. Ended up, he'd be picked up by different people. One fella got away in Oklahoma. He was picked up by the Mosier family, husband, wife, 3 kids, and the family dog, and ended up being driven around, or them driving around at gunpoint for 3 days until, by Billy's statement later, basically everyone kind of snapped. The wife started crying, the kids were crying and screaming, and basically everyone died, including the dog. Yeah. And the bodies were dumped here. And a plug for the Coleman Theater and Mysterious Four States on March 12th is that I've actually had at events a number of people come with personal accounts, including a now very elderly gentleman who was 15 at the time, who figured out after the fact that he had a run-in with Billy the night he dumped the bodies.
Yes.
And so ultimately the story, there were 8 victims total because he ended up going back to California. Long story short, they made it into a movie. The censors would not let them tell the whole story.
Yeah.
So they just told the very end of the story, and they could not directly show murders. They changed the facts slightly, but everyone knew what they were talking about because it was a national story. It was actually the largest manhunt in U.S. history until Osama bin Laden.
Wow.
And so everyone knew who they were talking about. The movie The Hitchhiker, which is still known as probably the best noir suspense movie ever made.
And it is good.
It is very, very good. And so, yes, it is the reason your mother told you not to hitchhike or pick up hitchhikers.
Yes. On Route 66 in particular.
And yeah, because he did fly Route 66 from here to California and back.
And all of this took place, the murders themselves and much of Billy Cook's story took place within the Missouri Ozarks.
Yes, the Missouri Ozarks, the Oklahoma Ozarks, and a little bit of it actually in Arkansas.
Yes, incredible. Absolutely incredible. So be careful out there.
Yes, don't pick up hitchhikers.
That's probably a pretty good place for us to close for the evening.
I'd say so.
Yeah. We will be in Branson live. Invite all of you to join us in Branson on February 16th, I believe, Wednesday, February 16th, 2022, at Savage Gear in downtown Branson. We'll have details soon.
Yeah. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
Yes, it is.
Everyone have a good night, and we'll be back here next week.
Absolutely. Appreciate y'all for joining us, and thank you, Lisa. You rock.
Oh, thanks, Josh. You're awesome, and thank you, everyone.
Night, everybody.